Welcome to my channel. Try to hear the latest story.
I stared through my kitchen window at the U-Haul truck parked in my driveway, my coffee mug frozen halfway to my lips. My entire family stood clustered around the back of the vehicle, pulling out boxes and furniture like they owned the place. My sister Sarah dangled a set of keys in the morning sunlight, gesturing toward my cabin, as if she was giving a tour to potential buyers. I had never given anyone permission to move into my home, especially not while I was still recovering from the construction accident that nearly killed me 3 months ago. Yet here they were acting like I should be grateful they were taking over the mountain sanctuary I had spent 3 years building with my own hands. I threw open my front door and marched toward the moving truck, my left leg still aching from the steel beam that had crushed it on the job site. Sarah turned toward me. With that bright fake smile she had perfected during her years working in customer service before starting her catering business. Terry, perfect timing. We were just getting started. She jingled the keys again, and I recognized them immediately as the spare set I had given our parents for emergencies. Mom and Dad explained everything about how you've been struggling since the accident, and we thought this would be the perfect solution. What solution? I demanded, watching, as her husband Brad directed 2 men I didn't recognize toward my porch, carrying a commercial-grade refrigerator. I never agreed to any solution. My mother stepped forward, wrapping her cardigan tighter around her shoulders despite the warm September morning. Honey, you've been so isolated up here since you got hurt. Sarah's catering business needs a venue for outdoor weddings, and this place is just sitting empty while you recover. It's not sitting empty. I live here. Dad emerged from behind the truck carrying a folding table, his face set in that stubborn expression I remembered from childhood arguments. Son, be reasonable. Sarah's business is in trouble, and she needs help. This cabin could be the perfect wedding venue for her clients. You'd get rental income, and she'd get the space she needs to turn things around. I watched Brad supervise the men carrying equipment toward my workshop, noting how he seemed to know exactly where everything should go. This wasn't a spontaneous family intervention. This was planned, organized, and executed without any input from me whatsoever. When exactly did you all decide I needed help? I asked, keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. Sarah pulled out a folder from her purse, her movements efficient and practiced. We've been discussing it for weeks, Terry. Mom and Dad were worried about your mental state after the accident, especially with all those pain medications you were taking. They thought it might be better if we helped make some decisions while you focused on healing. The folder contained legal documents, contracts, and what appeared to be venue rental agreements. I saw my name on several papers, but my signature wasn't on any of them. My hands shook as I flipped through page after page of agreements I had never seen before. Who signed these? I asked, though I was already dreading the answer. Dad signed as your temporary guardian. Sarah explained, her tone becoming more businesslike. Uncle Frank handled all the paperwork while you were in the hospital. It's all completely legal and above board. We just need you to acknowledge the arrangement and help us get settled. Uncle Frank. My father's brother who practiced law in the next county over. I remembered him visiting me in the hospital, asking questions about my finances and insurance coverage. I had been so doped up on pain medication that most of those conversations were hazy memories. But I definitely didn't remember agreeing to let him become my guardian. I want to see these guardianship papers. I said, my voice harder now. Brad finished directing his helpers and walked over to our group, wiping his hands on his jeans. Everything's going to work out great, Terry. Sarah's got 3 weddings booked for next month already. This place is going to be booked solid once word gets out. 3 weddings? Next month on my property? Without my consent. I looked around at my family, searching their faces for any sign that someone understood how wrong this was. My mother looked anxious but hopeful. My father appeared determined to push forward regardless of my objections. Sarah radiated confidence and excitement about her business prospects. And Brad watched me with calculating eyes like he was assessing whether I would be a problem that needed solving. I need time to think about this, I said finally. Of course, Sarah said quickly. We'll just get the basic setup done today and you can take all the time you need to review everything. Frank made sure all the legal aspects were handled properly, so there's no pressure. But there was pressure. The moving truck was here. The equipment was being unloaded. Contracts were apparently signed. My family had made decisions about my life and my property without asking me, and now they expected me to go along with their plan because it was already in motion. As I watched Brad's helpers carry more catering equipment toward my cabin, one detail caught my attention that made my blood run cold. The men weren't just random movers. They were wearing shirts with Morrison Construction printed on the back, Brad's company. The same company that had been the subcontractor on my job site when I was injured. That night, after my family had finally left with promises to return in the morning to continue setting up, I sat in my living room, staring at the legal documents Sarah had left behind. The rental agreements were professionally drafted, complete with liability waivers and detailed specifications for event hosting. But what disturbed me most were the client contracts Sarah had shown me. The weddings she had booked weren't small, intimate affairs. They were elaborate events for wealthy clients willing to pay premium prices for exclusive mountain venues. I pulled out my laptop and started researching Morrison Construction, Brad's company. What I found made me sick to my stomach. Morrison Construction specialized in luxury resort development with a particular focus on acquiring scenic properties in remote locations. Their website featured a portfolio of projects where they had transformed private residences into commercial venues, before eventually developing them into full-scale resorts. But it was the client testimonials that really caught my attention. Several previous property owners mentioned how Morrison Construction had helped them transition from private ownership to commercial partnerships after unexpected financial difficulties. Injuries, medical bills, and temporary incapacity seemed to be common themes in these success stories. I dug deeper into the contracts Sarah had left behind and discovered something that made my hands shake. The venue rental agreement wasn't just for Sarah's catering business. It was a partnership agreement between Sarah's company and Morrison Construction, with Morrison providing all infrastructure improvements, event coordination, and long-term development planning. My cabin wasn't being rented for Sarah's struggling catering business. It was being positioned as a showcase property for Brad's resort development company. The 3 wedding contracts Sarah had mentioned were all for clients of Morrison Construction, high-profile couples looking for unique venues that could potentially become permanent vacation destinations. Each contract included clauses about photography rights, promotional materials, and exclusive access agreements that would effectively turn my private residence into a marketing tool for Brad's business. I called the hospital where I had been treated and requested copies of all the paperwork from my stay. What I discovered in those records sent chills down my spine. According to the medical files, I had been prescribed significantly higher doses of pain medication than I remembered taking. The notes indicated that family members had expressed concerns about my mental state and decision-making capacity, leading to recommendations for temporary guardianship arrangements. But I remembered my recovery differently. Yes, I had been in pain and dealing with the trauma of a serious injury, but I had been alert, making rational decisions about my treatment and eager to return home. The picture painted in these medical records describes someone who was confused, dependent, and incapable of managing his own affairs. I spent hours going through every document, every signature, every date and timestamp. The pattern that emerged was methodical and coordinated. While I was focused on my physical recovery, my family and Uncle Frank had been systematically building a legal framework to take control of my property and my decisions. The most damning evidence came in the form of emails I found on my old laptop messages I had completely forgotten about. During my hospital stay, I had received several emails from Brad asking about my cabin, my insurance coverage, and my financial situation. I had responded to some of them during my first week home, when I was still taking pain medication and feeling grateful for my family's concern. In those emails, I had mentioned feeling overwhelmed by bills, worried about my ability to maintain the property while I couldn't work, and open to suggestions about generating income. Brad had responded with sympathy and offers to help, gradually steering the conversation toward the idea of temporary rental arrangements that could help cover my expenses. Reading those emails now, I could see how my legitimate concerns had been twisted into justification for their plan. My temporary financial anxiety had been presented to Uncle Frank as evidence that I needed help managing my affairs. My gratitude for family support had been interpreted as agreement to their business proposal. But the detail that made everything click into place was buried in the metadata of the email files. The timestamp showed that Brad had been forwarding my emails to someone else before responding to me. Someone with an email address registered to a legal consulting firm that specialized in property development and guardianship arrangements. My workplace accident hadn't been random bad luck. My family's intervention wasn't motivated by love and concern. My cabin wasn't being rented to help Sarah's struggling catering business. This was a coordinated effort to take control of my property for Brad's business expansion, using my temporary vulnerability as an opportunity to circumvent normal legal processes. As I sat in my living room, surrounded by evidence of their deception, one more detail caught my eye that made everything even worse. The insurance paperwork from my workplace injury listed Morrison Construction as the primary contractor responsible for site safety. Brad hadn't just taken advantage of my accident to steal my property. He had been in a position to prevent the accident in the first place. The next morning, I was ready when my family arrived. I had spent the night organizing all the evidence I had discovered and preparing questions that would force them to reveal the true scope of their plan. Sarah knocked on my door at exactly 8 o'clock, carrying coffee and pastries like she was hosting a business meeting. "I brought breakfast," she announced cheerfully, pushing past me into my kitchen. "I thought we could go over the schedule for the next few weeks and make sure you're comfortable with everything." Brad and my parents followed her inside, along with Uncle Frank, who I hadn't expected to see. He was a thin man in his 60s with carefully styled gray hair and expensive clothes that seemed out of place in my rustic cabin. He carried a leather briefcase and had the demeanor of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Terry," Uncle Frank said, extending his hand for a shake. "Good to see you looking so much better. Your parents have been worried about you." I shook his hand but didn't return his smile. "I've been looking over the paperwork you prepared. I have some questions." "Of course," he said smoothly. "I'm sure this all seems overwhelming, but everything has been carefully structured to protect your interests while providing the support you need." Sarah spread the breakfast items on my counter and began making coffee like she lived there. "The first wedding is scheduled for October 15th. The couple specifically chose this location because of the mountain views and the authentic rustic atmosphere. They're paying $12,000 for the weekend plus catering fees." "That's just for one weekend?" I asked, genuinely surprised by the amount. "Premium clients pay premium prices," Brad explained, settling into my favorite chair without invitation. "These aren't ordinary people, Terry. They're business executives, celebrities, people who value exclusivity and privacy. Your cabin offers something they can't get at traditional venues." Uncle Frank opened his briefcase and pulled out additional documents. "The guardianship arrangement is temporary and limited in scope. It simply allows your family to help manage certain financial decisions while you complete your recovery. Once you're back to full capacity, you can resume complete control of your affairs." "And when exactly will that be?" I asked. "The medical evaluation is scheduled for 6 months from the initial filing," he said, consulting his notes. "Based on your current progress, I expect you'll be cleared for full independence well before then." 6 months. They had given themselves 6 months to establish their business operation on my property, build relationships with high-paying clients, and create financial arrangements that would be difficult to unwind. 6 months to transform my private residence into a commercial venue and position themselves as essential partners in its operation. What happens to the client contracts if I decide I don't want to continue with this arrangement? I asked. Sarah's cheerful expression flickered for just a moment. Well, we'd have to honor the existing contracts, of course. We can't just cancel on people who've already made deposits and arrangements. But after that, we could certainly discuss alternatives. What kind of deposits are we talking about? The 3 October weddings represent about $50,000 in total deposits, Brad said. Plus, we've got interest from several other potential clients for next year. This could easily become a 6-figure annual income stream for you. $50,000. If I tried to cancel their arrangements now, I would be responsible for returning money that had already been collected and potentially face lawsuits from disappointed clients. They had positioned the situation so that backing out would be financially devastating for me. I noticed Morrison Construction is listed as a partner in these contracts. I said, watching Brad's reaction carefully. What exactly is your company's role in this arrangement? Infrastructure and logistics. He answered without hesitation. Wedding venues require permits, safety inspections, utility upgrades, parking arrangements. My company handles all the technical aspects so Sarah can focus on the catering and event coordination. And what does Morrison Construction get in return for these services? Uncle Frank intervened before Brad could answer. All financial arrangements are clearly detailed in the partnership agreement. Morrison Construction receives a percentage of gross revenues in exchange for infrastructure investment and ongoing maintenance responsibilities. What percentage? 40%, Sarah said quietly. 40%. For a 6-figure annual income stream, Morrison Construction would be taking home more money than I would from my own property. But even more concerning was the long-term implication. If Brad's company was making substantial infrastructure investments and taking on maintenance responsibilities, they would have legitimate claims to continued partnership even after my guardianship ended. I want to see the infrastructure investment plans, I said. Uncle Frank and Brad exchanged a quick glance that told me I had touched on something they hadn't wanted to discuss yet. The immediate improvements are relatively minor, Uncle Frank said carefully. Parking area expansion utility upgrades, some landscaping modifications, nothing that would fundamentally alter the character of the property. But there are plans for more substantial changes later, I pressed. Brad leaned forward in his chair, his demeanor shifting from casual to serious. Terry, if this venue becomes successful, there will be opportunities for expansion. Additional guest facilities, maybe some permanent structures for events, but all of that would be years down the road and would require your full approval. Years down the road, after Morrison Construction had established themselves as essential partners, after my cabin had been legally transformed from a private residence to a commercial venue, after their infrastructure investments gave them legal claims to continued partnership, regardless of my preferences. I looked around the room at my family, people I had trusted my entire life, and realized they had been planning to steal my home while I was recovering from an injury that might have been deliberately caused. They had used my temporary vulnerability to create legal arrangements that would be nearly impossible to escape. And they expected me to be grateful for their help. I need time to think about all of this, I said finally. Of course, Uncle Frank said, standing up to leave. Take all the time you need. But remember, we have legal obligations to the clients who have already made commitments. The October weddings are going to happen regardless of any concerns you might have. After they left, I sat alone in my kitchen, staring at the business cards Uncle Frank had left behind. Legal consulting firm, property development specialists, guardianship attorneys. This wasn't a family helping an injured relative. This was a business operation using family relationships to circumvent legal protections that would normally prevent this kind of exploitation. But as I looked more closely at Uncle Frank's business card, I noticed something that made my heart race. The address listed was for an office building that had been demolished 2 years ago. I remembered because I had worked on the demolition crew. Uncle Frank's law practice apparently didn't exist at the address he was claiming. I spent the next 3 days conducting the most important investigation of my life. Using my laptop and phone, I systematically researched every aspect of the arrangement my family had created. What I discovered was worse than I had imagined. Uncle Frank's law practice was registered to a mail forwarding service, not a legitimate office. His state bar license showed a history of disciplinary actions for ethical violations, including 2 suspensions in the past 5 years. The most recent suspension had been for conflicts of interest in property development cases, where he had represented multiple parties with competing interests. Morrison Construction's safety record was even more damning. Over the past 3 years, Brad's company had been cited for dozens of workplace safety violations. 4 serious injuries on job sites managed by Morrison Construction, all involving structural failures or equipment malfunctions. In each case, the injured workers had subsequently lost their homes or businesses due to medical expenses and lost income. But the pattern that emerged was what made everything click into place. In 3 of those 4 cases, the injured workers' properties had eventually been acquired by development companies connected to Morrison Construction. Properties that had been transformed into commercial venues or resorts, generating substantial profits for the developers, while the original owners received minimal compensation. I found court records showing that Brad had used similar guardianship arrangements in other cases. Family members petitioning for temporary guardianship of injured relatives with Uncle Frank handling the legal paperwork. Properties being transferred to business partnerships while the owners were incapacitated. Legal arrangements that were difficult to challenge once they were established. My workplace accident fit the exact same pattern. I had been injured due to equipment failure on a Morrison Construction job site. My family had immediately began discussing guardianship arrangements with Uncle Frank. My property was being transferred to a business partnership with Morrison Construction, and now I was being pressured to accept the arrangement as beneficial for everyone involved. I called the state attorney general's office and spoke with an investigator who specialized in elder abuse and guardianship fraud. She listened to my story with professional interest, taking detailed notes about dates, documents, and financial arrangements. "What you're describing sounds like a pattern we've been tracking," she told me. Deliberate injuries, followed by fraudulent guardianship arrangements to facilitate property theft. We've been building cases against several individuals involved in these schemes. She asked me to forward all the documentation I had gathered and promised to have investigators review my situation within 48 hours. She also warned me that if my family was involved in organized fraud, they might take drastic action if they suspected I was investigating them. "Be careful about who you trust," she advised. "People involved in these schemes often have contingency plans for dealing with uncooperative victims." That warning proved prophetic sooner than I expected. That evening, Sarah showed up at my door alone, without Brad or our parents. She looked nervous and kept glancing over her shoulder as if she was worried about being followed. "Can I come in?" she asked. "I need to talk to you about something important." I let her inside, curious about what she might reveal when she wasn't performing for the rest of the family. She declined my offer of coffee and paced around my living room like she was trying to work up courage to say something difficult. "Terry, there are things about this arrangement that you don't understand," she said finally. "Things that Brad and Uncle Frank haven't told you?" "What kind of things?" She sat down on my couch and took a deep breath. "The catering business is real, but it's not the main purpose of this plan. Brad needs your property for something bigger. He's been working with developers who want to build a resort on this mountain, and your cabin is the centerpiece of their plan." This wasn't news to me, but I pretended to be surprised. "A resort? A luxury mountain resort with your cabin as the main lodge. They want to build guest facilities, a spa, maybe even a golf course. The wedding venue idea is just the first step to establish commercial use of the property and get around zoning restrictions. And you agreed to help them steal my home." She looked genuinely distressed. "It wasn't supposed to be stealing. Brad said you'd be a full partner in the resort development, that you'd make millions from the sale and could buy any property you wanted. But I never agreed to sell. Brad said you would once you understood the financial benefits. He said the injury had made you depressed and that you weren't thinking clearly about your future. Uncle Frank assured us that the guardianship arrangement was just a formality to protect you during your recovery. I could see tears forming in her eyes. And for the first time since this began, she looked like the sister I remembered growing up with. Sarah, did Brad tell you anything about how my accident happened? Her expression changed immediately. The nervous energy transformed into something closer to fear. What do you mean? I mean, did Brad ever mention anything about the equipment that failed? About the safety inspections? About whether the accident could have been prevented? She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the pieces clicking together in her mind. Oh, God. Terry, you don't think... I think Brad has done this before. I think he deliberately injures people so he can take their property. And I think Uncle Frank helps him create legal arrangements to make the theft look legitimate. Sarah covered her face with her hands and started crying in earnest. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Brad said he was helping us, helping the family. He said you needed support and that this would be good for everyone. Sarah, I need you to tell me everything. Every conversation you've had with Brad about this plan. Every detail about how Uncle Frank got involved. Everything about the resort development and the investor partnerships. What she told me over the next 2 hours was the final piece of the puzzle I needed to understand the full scope of their operation. Brad and Uncle Frank had been working together for years, targeting property owners who could be made vulnerable through deliberate accidents or family crises. The guardianship arrangements were just one tool they used. They also employed marriage fraud business partnerships and insurance schemes depending on the specific situation. My case was particularly valuable because my cabin occupied a strategic location for resort development. The mountain had limited private property, and most of it was owned by families who had held their land for generations. My cabin was the perfect anchor property for a development that could eventually encompass thousands of acres. But Sarah also revealed something that made the situation even more urgent. Brad is getting impatient, she said. He told me yesterday that if you don't cooperate willingly, there are other ways to handle the situation. He mentioned something about having you committed for psychiatric evaluation. Committed? He has documentation from your hospital stay showing mental instability. Uncle Frank thinks he can get a court order for involuntary commitment if you fight the guardianship arrangement. Once you're committed, they can complete the property transfer and establish the business partnerships without your interference. They were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent and locked away in a psychiatric facility while they stole everything I owned. The guardianship arrangement was just the beginning. If I didn't cooperate, they were prepared to destroy my life completely to get what they wanted. But Sarah had given me something more valuable than just information. She had given me a witness, someone who could testify about their real plans and their willingness to use illegal methods to achieve their goals. Sarah, are you willing to help me stop this? She looked terrified, but she nodded. Brad isn't the man I thought I married. If he's been hurting people to steal their property, I can't be part of that. What do you need me to do? Working with Sarah as an inside source, I spent the next week gathering evidence and building relationships with other victims of Brad's schemes. The state attorney general's investigator, Detective Martinez, had connected me with 3 other families who had lost property through similar arrangements. Each case followed the same pattern: deliberate injury, family pressure for guardianship property transfer to business partnerships, and eventual development or resale at enormous profit. Sarah provided recordings of conversations with Brad and Uncle Frank, documenting their discussions about forced commitment and property seizure. She also copied financial records showing payments between Morrison Construction and Uncle Frank's consulting firm, evidence of the ongoing business relationship they had been hiding. Detective Martinez helped me understand the legal strategy Brad and Uncle Frank had been using. By establishing guardianship based on medical records and family testimony, they created a legal framework that was extremely difficult to challenge. Even if I regained full mental capacity, the business partnerships and property obligations would remain legally binding. The key is proving deliberate injury and fraudulent guardianship, Detective Martinez explained. If we can demonstrate that your accident was intentionally caused and that the guardianship was obtained through false information, we can void all the subsequent arrangements. I'd been working with a structural engineer to analyze the equipment failure that caused my accident. The analysis revealed that critical safety components had been deliberately tampered with, creating conditions that would inevitably lead to catastrophic failure. The tampering was subtle but unmistakable to an expert examination. But while I was building my case against Brad and Uncle Frank, they were accelerating their own timeline. Sarah warned me that they had become suspicious of her behavior and were planning to move forward with the commitment proceedings immediately. Brad found out I've been asking questions about the other properties, she told me during one of our secret meetings. He thinks I'm getting cold feet about the whole arrangement. Uncle Frank wants to file the commitment papers this week before you have time to cause problems. What kind of problems do they think I'm going to cause? Brad knows you've been researching Morrison Construction and asking questions about your accident. He's worried that you're building a case against him. Uncle Frank thinks the best strategy is to have you committed immediately and complete all the property transfers while you're locked away. The timeline had become critical. If they succeeded in having me committed, I would lose access to my evidence, my ability to communicate with investigators, and any legal standing to challenge their arrangements. Once I was declared mentally incompetent, everything I had discovered would be dismissed as the paranoid delusions of an unstable person. Detective Martinez accelerated her investigation and obtained warrants to search Morrison Construction's offices and Uncle Frank's consulting firm. But she warned me that they would likely destroy evidence if they suspected law enforcement was closing in. We need them to believe they're still in control, she explained. If they think you're cooperating with their plan, they'll be less likely to take extreme measures before we can make arrests. Sarah and I developed a strategy to convince Brad and Uncle Frank that I was ready to accept their arrangement. She would tell them that our conversations had convinced me to be reasonable about the situation. I would attend a family meeting and publicly agree to the guardianship extension and business partnerships. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday at my cabin. My entire family would be present along with Uncle Frank and the clients for the first scheduled wedding. Brad wanted the meeting to serve as both a family reconciliation and a business presentation to demonstrate the venue's potential. But what Brad and Uncle Frank didn't know was that Detective Martinez would have surveillance teams positioned around my property, recording everything that happened. If they proceeded with their illegal plans in front of witnesses and law enforcement surveillance, we would have everything we needed to arrest them. The week leading up to the meeting was the most stressful of my life. I had to continue acting like I was considering their proposal, while secretly coordinating with law enforcement and preparing for what might be my only opportunity to expose their crimes. Sarah's position became increasingly dangerous as Brad grew more suspicious of her loyalty. He began monitoring her communications and questioning her about our conversations. She had to be extremely careful about how and when she contacted me with updates about their plans. Brad is paranoid, she told me during our final secret meeting. He thinks someone is investigating Morrison Construction, but he doesn't know how much evidence exists. Uncle Frank is pushing for immediate action before anyone can interfere with their arrangements. What kind of immediate action? They're planning to have security personnel at the meeting on Friday. If you refuse to cooperate, or if they suspect you're working with law enforcement, they're prepared to force the commitment process. Uncle Frank has papers ready to be filed, and Brad has arranged for private security to escort you to a psychiatric facility. Private security, forced commitment, papers ready to be filed. They weren't just planning to steal my property. They were planning to kidnap me and destroy my life if I didn't cooperate with their demands. But I also knew that Friday's meeting would be their downfall. With law enforcement surveillance, recorded conversations, and physical evidence of their crimes, we would finally have everything needed to put them in prison where they belonged. The only question was whether I would survive long enough to see justice served. Friday morning arrived with crisp October air and brilliant autumn colors that made my mountain property look like something from a tourism brochure. I watched from my kitchen window as vehicles began arriving for what everyone expected to be a celebration of family cooperation and business success. Sarah and Brad arrived first, followed by my parents and Uncle Frank. Two unmarked vans parked at the bottom of my driveway, supposedly containing equipment for the wedding venue setup, but actually carrying the security personnel Brad had hired to force my compliance if necessary. The wedding clients, a wealthy couple from Atlanta, arrived in a luxury SUV with their event planner and photographer. They had been told this meeting was a final venue walkthrough before their October 15th ceremony, unaware they were about to witness the exposure of a criminal conspiracy. Uncle Frank had brought additional legal documents for me to sign, including updated guardianship papers and expanded business partnership agreements. These documents would give Morrison Construction complete control over my property and finances, while committing me to a psychiatric facility for evaluation and treatment. I had hidden recording equipment throughout my cabin, coordinating with Detective Martinez to ensure everything would be documented. Law enforcement surveillance teams were positioned in the surrounding woods, ready to intervene when Brad and Uncle Frank revealed their criminal intentions. The meeting began cordially, with everyone gathered in my living room while Sarah served coffee and pastries she had prepared for the occasion. The wedding clients admired my cabin's rustic architecture and mountain views, discussing their plans for the ceremony with genuine enthusiasm. "This is exactly what we were looking for," the bride told me. "Somewhere authentic and private, away from all the commercial wedding venues. Your family has created something really special here." Uncle Frank used the couple's enthusiasm as an opening to present his legal documents. "Terry has been working through some personal challenges since his accident, but he's ready to move forward with formalizing our business arrangements." He spread the papers across my coffee table, pointing out signature lines and explaining how the documents would protect everyone's interests. The guardianship extension would remain in place for another year while I completed my recovery. The business partnership would give Morrison Construction expanded authority to make improvements and market the venue to additional clients. These arrangements benefit everyone. Uncle Frank explained to the wedding clients using their presence to create social pressure for my compliance. Terry gets professional management and guaranteed income. Sarah gets the venue she needs for her catering business, and clients get access to an exclusive mountain location. I picked up the documents and pretended to review them carefully, though I had already studied every clause with my attorney. "This all looks very thorough," I said loud enough for the recording equipment to capture clearly. "But I have some questions about the long-term plans for the property." Brad leaned forward eagerly. "What kind of questions?" "Well, I noticed these contracts include provisions for substantial infrastructure development, permanent structures, utility expansion, road improvements. This sounds like more than just a wedding venue." Uncle Frank and Brad exchanged glances, and I could see them calculating how much to reveal in front of witnesses. "The infrastructure improvements would enhance the property's value," Uncle Frank said carefully. "Any development would require your approval, of course." "But what kind of development are we talking about? Guest cabins, a restaurant, a full resort?" The wedding clients looked suddenly interested in this conversation. They hadn't been told about potential resort development that might affect the exclusive private atmosphere they were paying for. Brad decided to be more direct. "Terry, there are opportunities for this property that go far beyond wedding venues. With the right partnerships, this could become a destination resort that would set you up financially for life. And if I don't want my property to become a resort, then you'd be making a serious mistake," Brad said, his tone hardening. "You're not in a position to manage this property effectively on your own. The guardianship arrangement exists because you've demonstrated poor judgment about your own interests. Uncle Frank tried to steer the conversation back to the documents. Terry, these arrangements are already legally binding. Your signature today is just a formality to acknowledge what's already been established. Actually, I said, standing up and walking to my fireplace, I've been doing some research about these arrangements, and I've discovered some very interesting things about Morrison Construction and your consulting practice. The atmosphere in the room changed immediately. Brad's casual demeanor disappeared, replaced by alert tension. Uncle Frank's professional smile became strained. Sarah looked nervous, though the others interpreted her anxiety as concern about my mental state. What kind of research? Uncle Frank asked. Well, for example, I learned that Morrison Construction has an unusual history of workplace accidents involving property owners who subsequently lose their homes to development companies. I also learned that your law practice doesn't actually exist at the address on your business cards. The wedding clients looked confused by this turn in conversation. The bride whispered something to her fiancé, and their event planner began gathering her materials as if preparing to leave. Brad stood up abruptly. Terry, you're not thinking clearly. The accident affected you more than you realize. These paranoid theories are exactly why you need professional help. Paranoid theories, like the theory that my workplace accident was deliberately caused by tampering with safety equipment, or the theory that you've done this to other people before me. Uncle Frank was packing his briefcase, signaling to Brad that the meeting was over. I think we should continue this discussion in a more private setting. Terry clearly needs medical evaluation before he can make rational decisions about his situation. You mean psychiatric commitment? I said clearly. That's what you're really planning, isn't it? If I don't sign these papers willingly, you'll have me committed to a psychiatric facility and complete the property transfer while I'm locked away. The wedding clients stood up simultaneously, clearly uncomfortable with the conflict they had stumbled into. Perhaps we should reschedule, the groom said diplomatically. But Brad was done with pretense. He signaled toward the door, and two large men in security uniforms entered my cabin without invitation. Terry, you're going to come with us for a psychiatric evaluation. Your family is concerned about your mental state, and we have legal authority to transport you for assessment. Legal authority from who? Uncle Frank pulled out official-looking documents. I have a court order authorizing involuntary commitment based on your family's testimony about your paranoid behavior and inability to make rational decisions. The security guards moved toward me, but I held up my hand to stop them. Before you do anything you'll regret, I think you should know that this entire conversation has been recorded, and that law enforcement officers are positioned outside this cabin with warrants for your arrest. Uncle Frank and Brad froze their eyes, darting toward the windows. Sarah moved away from Brad, positioning herself closer to my parents and the door. You're bluffing, Brad said, but his voice lacked conviction. I walked to my front door and opened it wide. Detective Martinez, I think it's time for you to join our meeting. Detective Martinez entered my cabin with 4 other officers' weapons drawn and badges visible. The security guards immediately raised their hands and stepped away from me. Bradford Morrison and Franklin Hayes, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, guardianship abuse, and attempted kidnapping, Detective Martinez announced. You have the right to remain silent. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Uncle Frank tried one final deception. This is a misunderstanding. All of our arrangements are completely legal and properly documented, including the forged court order for psychiatric commitment, Detective Martinez asked, holding up the papers he had presented moments earlier. Including the fraudulent guardianship based on false medical records, including the deliberate sabotage that caused Mr. Anderson's workplace injury. Brad's face went white as he realized the scope of evidence law enforcement had gathered. I want a lawyer. You'll have plenty of time to discuss legal representation, Detective Martinez replied. After we finish processing you for attempted kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy, and assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. The wedding clients fled the scene as quickly as possible, clearly wanting no part of the criminal proceedings they had accidentally witnessed. My parents looked stunned by the revelation that their trusted family lawyer and Sarah's husband were criminals who had manipulated them into participating in a scheme to steal their son's property. But the biggest shock was yet to come. As Detective Martinez continued reading charges, she mentioned conspiracy involving fraudulent romantic relationships and embezzlement of family funds. I looked at Sarah, confused about what this meant. "There's something else you need to know about your sister's involvement," Detective Martinez said gently. "Sarah, would you like to explain, or shall I?" Sarah's face crumpled as she broke down completely. Through her tears, she confessed that her relationship with Brad had been built on lies from the beginning. She had discovered that Brad was having an affair with Uncle Frank's assistant and that they had been embezzling money from her catering business and our parents' retirement account to fund their property development schemes. "I thought I was helping save my marriage and my business," she sobbed. "I didn't know they were stealing from Mom and Dad. I didn't know they were planning to hurt you permanently. When I found out about the other victims, I realized I had to help stop them." The relief I felt at learning Sarah had ultimately chosen to do the right thing was overwhelming. My family had been manipulated and deceived, but they weren't willing participants in a scheme to destroy my life. 3 months later, I stood on my front porch watching the sunrise over the mountains, holding a cup of coffee, and feeling truly at peace for the first time since my accident. The legal proceedings were complete, and justice had been served in ways that exceeded my most optimistic expectations. Brad was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for conspiracy fraud and deliberately causing injuries to multiple victims. The evidence we gathered had led to additional charges involving 7 other cases where he had targeted property owners through staged accidents and fraudulent guardianship arrangements. The families who had lost their homes were able to recover their properties and receive substantial compensation. Uncle Frank received 8 years for his role in the guardianship fraud and property theft schemes. His law license was permanently revoked, and he was ordered to make restitution to all the families he had helped victimize. The investigation revealed that he had been operating without a valid license for over 2 years, using fake credentials to legitimize his criminal activities. Sarah's cooperation with law enforcement earned her immunity from prosecution, though she still faced the personal consequences of her failed marriage and business. She had moved back in with our parents while rebuilding her life and working to repair the relationship she had damaged through her involvement with Brad's schemes. The financial recovery exceeded anything I had hoped for. Morrison Construction's assets were seized and liquidated to provide restitution to Brad's victims. Insurance settlements from the workplace injury covered all my medical expenses and provided additional compensation for the deliberate nature of the accident. Most importantly, my property remained completely under my control, free from any business partnerships or legal encumbrances. My parents had been devastated to learn how they had been manipulated into supporting a criminal conspiracy against their own son. They spent weeks apologizing and working to understand how they had been so thoroughly deceived by people they trusted. Our relationship, while strained by the experience, was slowly healing as we worked through the trauma together. Dad came to understand that his desire to help both his children had been exploited by criminals who saw our family's love as a weakness to be manipulated. I explained to the victim support counselor who helped our family process the emotional aftermath. Mom realized that her worry about my independence after the injury had been twisted into justification for taking away my autonomy completely. The most meaningful outcome was the relationships I built with other victims of similar schemes. We formed a support network and advocacy group dedicated to helping families recognize and prevent guardianship fraud. Detective Martinez connected us with legislators working to strengthen laws protecting vulnerable adults from exploitation by family members and legal professionals. I used part of the financial settlement to establish a foundation that provides legal assistance to people fighting fraudulent guardianship arrangements. Too many families suffer in silence when criminals exploit temporary vulnerability to steal everything they own. Our foundation has already helped dozens of families recover their property and their dignity. My cabin became exactly what it was always meant to be: a peaceful retreat, where I could heal, create, and build genuine relationships with people who valued my boundaries and respected my decisions. I finished my recovery from the accident and returned to construction work, specializing in helping other victims rebuild their properties and their lives. Sarah eventually started a legitimate catering business, this time built on honest work and authentic relationships, rather than criminal schemes. She became one of our foundation's most effective advocates, using her experience to help other families recognize when they're being manipulated by people they trust. The experience taught me that true family protects and supports each other without seeking to control or exploit. It taught me that setting boundaries isn't selfish, but necessary for maintaining healthy relationships. Most importantly, it taught me that trusting my instincts and standing up for myself wasn't paranoid or unreasonable, but essential for my survival. 6 months after the arrests, I received a letter from one of Brad's previous victims, an elderly man who had lost his farm to a similar scheme. "Thank you for having the courage to fight back," he wrote. "Your willingness to expose these criminals prevented them from destroying more families. You gave all of us hope that justice is still possible." That letter reminded me why everything I had endured was worthwhile. By refusing to accept their lies and fighting for the truth, I had protected not only myself but countless future victims who would have suffered if Brad and Uncle Frank had been allowed to continue their crimes. Standing on my porch that morning, I realized that my accident had ultimately led me to something more valuable than the cabin I had fought to protect. It had led me to discover my own strength to build relationships based on genuine trust and respect, and to find purpose in protecting other people from the predators who exploit family bonds for personal gain. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where people you trusted were working against your best interests? How did you find the courage to stand up for yourself when it meant challenging family members or authority figures? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to hear more stories about people who fought back against injustice and won. Share this with anyone who might be dealing with similar family manipulation or legal exploitation. Together, we can help protect vulnerable people from predators who see family loyalty as an opportunity for theft. Thank you for listening to my story and for supporting others who are fighting to reclaim their lives from those who would exploit their trust. Remember that you have the right to set boundaries, to question arrangements made without your consent, and to seek help when people you trust are working against your interests. Your instincts are valid. Your autonomy matters, and your willingness to fight for justice can make a difference for others facing similar challenges. Stay strong, trust yourself, and never stop fighting for what's right.